And welcome back to the Financially Simple Podcast. Today we're going to begin our deep dive into the area of risk management. As you may recall, we begin season number 2 with a focus on personal finances for business owners. Yes, that's right. In season number 1, we dealt with the business. We talked about how to start it, grow it, sell it, and increase the value. And now I want to spend some time dealing with personal finances. We talked a lot about cash flow, how we get paid, and where we spend our money. But before we can get into what I call the sexy part of financial planning, which is investing, before we can get there, we need to make sure that we have some protections in place. So the fancy term is called risk management. You already heard that. But in a nutshell, we're going to be dealing with insurances and legal documents for your personal home. Perhaps there's no insurance which personally bothers me more than auto insurance. Now, I don't know why it bothers me, but it does. It just drives me crazy. Perhaps it's a government-required insurance. Maybe it's my libertarian style views. I'm not that crazy, but I think the government needs to stay out of our lives. Maybe it's that they require us to have it. In fact, it's illegal not to have car insurance. And if you happen to be in an accident and you're sued and you don't have insurance, not only will you be fined, but you could potentially go bankrupt. So you need to make sure that you have car insurance. So let's deal with car insurance. I'm going to upload to the Financially Simple blog, as it corresponds with this particular show, which you can see in the show notes below. I'm going to upload my personal deck page, or what's called a declaration page. Now, I've obviously blurred out some of the key areas of my life for privacy protection, but it'll allow you as a point of reference to see what I'm talking about. See, even as a financial planner, years ago, I really didn't know very much about car insurance. Not until I took the CFP exam, the Certified Financial Planner exam, did I ever dive into car insurance. Before then, I'd go visit my broker or my agent, as we talked about in the last episode, and I would listen to that advice that he would provide or she would provide, and then I would go in and purchase the coverage and forget about it after that point. Only to realize that there's a lot of details here that we may want to know about. So car insurance is easily broken down into a couple of key decisions. Before I can get to those key decisions, let's talk about the basic elements of most car insurance policies here in the United States. The first thing that's going to come into play is liability protection. In a nutshell, liability protection protects you, protects your financial resources, those things we're going to deal with about investing in a little while and a couple episodes coming up. But it basically protects your resources. So if you are deemed to be at fault in a car accident, the liability portion is going to cover are going to pay the repairs, the medical cost, the things that are related, maybe even like a legal fees if you're sued for that. The liability protection is going to come in and cover the majority, if not all, of those expenses. And the way that liability coverage is broken down in a car insurance policy is into two basic areas. The first is what's called bodily injury. Yes, if you get in an accident and somebody gets hurt, we all know how expensive medicine is. And it's a global thing. And obviously doctors who go to school and go through resident programs, they spend 20 years of their life perfecting medicine. They should be paid and paid fairly for their abilities. So with that, medicine gets to be expensive. So one of the coverages under liability is the bodily injury report. Now, in my personal policy, I'm going to talk a lot about my policies. I elected to use $250,000 of coverage per person and $500,000 of coverage per occurrence. You may say, well, Justin, that seems awful low or that seems awful high. Well, we're going to talk about another coverage I have in place called an umbrella policy in the near future. In fact, 3 episodes from now, we're going to deal with that. But on my particular policy, I have a $250,000 per person per occurrence policy to a maximum of $500,000 for each occurrence. Whenever I was in high school, I had a dear friend of mine who, how do I say this? They got in a really bad accident, and a couple people were killed, and there was a lawsuit. And The coverage here that I'm talking about, the bodily injury coverage, was there to care for the people, but it didn't cover all the expenses because the limits were very low. And this individual did not have additional coverage in place, like an umbrella policy, and they ended up facing, and they actually did go through bankruptcy because they did not have the right amount of coverages. So you could actually incur a lot of damage, a lot of liability here in this one little area of your auto insurance policy. Somebody gets hurt in an accident, the bodily injury liability is there to help with that. Another liability coverage is what's called property damage coverage. Now, if you are someone else's property, like your car, their car, maybe it's you ran over a mailbox. I've done that before, okay? I ran over a mailbox one time that had to have a mason come in and rebuild. It was not cheap. The insurance company covered that. Now, on my particular policy, I have $100,000 per occurrence. Another friend of mine in high school, he was driving a little small S10 pickup truck, and he happened to hit a wedding procession going down the road. Don't ask me why it was a wedding procession, but they happened to have Corvettes and Maseratis, and there was a Lamborghini in there and a Jaguar. And he managed to sideswipe about 5 of those high-end cars. Once again, he did not have the right amount of liability protection, and he ended up having to deal with some legal issues. So when it comes to your car insurance, one of the first things you want to recognize is that you need to have liability protection because it helps protect your other assets. Now, not only are you going to protect your personal assets, your cash, your investments, etc., but you need to protect you and your passengers. So there's a coverage that's in most policies called an uninsured motorist policy, or uninsured motorist coverage, and inside that there's a bodily injury portion of that uninsured motorist coverage. And basically it's covered whenever either driver or when any driver is at fault, okay, and if someone is uninsured, this will come into play to help. So let's say that you did not cause the accident. I misspoke. It comes into play when you're not at fault, and the person who harms your car, your people, did not have coverage, or maybe they're a hit and run. That happens a lot. I hear more and more about that these days. So somebody hits you, somebody causes an accident, and they do not have coverage. Well, an uninsured motorist bodily injury will come in and cover the medical issues that you or your family may have because somebody else did not have that coverage. Now, in my personal family, we have $500,000 per accident for personal bodily injuries. Another coverage that we have when you're protecting your passengers is the actual medical payment. So this way may be where you are at fault. So we talked about somebody where you're not at fault, an uninsured motorist. Now maybe you are at fault. And with this fault, you cause injury to yourself or to pedestrians in another car, riders in another car. Pedestrians walk across the street, riders in the car. See, I'm getting... Anyways, I currently have $500,000 of coverage in this particular area. Medical payments is the way mine is broken down. And so medical payments covers the passengers. Some policies don't break it down in medical payments. Some policies just describe it as medical coverage. There's also what's called extended benefits. Now, some policies may or may not include this. Some policies do. Basically, it creates, if somebody becomes disabled because of the policy, it can help provide long-term disability for those providers in your vehicle. So now that we've dealt with protecting your assets with the liability coverage, and we've talked about protecting the riders, you and your passengers, what about the car? Yeah, there's a couple of basic, and this is where most people kind of recognize some language. The primary, the baseline coverage is what's called collision. If you're in an auto accident, and it doesn't matter whose fault it is, the collision insurance provides the protection to replace it, repair it, fix it, etc., but it's subject to a deductible. So you can end up having something like a tree fall on your car. You could, I saw a vehicle not too long ago that was going across a small bridge by our house and actually sideswiped the guardrail and did some damage to the car. Collision would come in to cover that type. Now, there is a deductible involved. I have a $1,000 deductible on my collision policy. So if I create damage and the damage costs me $2,500, I'm going to pay the first $1,000 out of my pocket, and the insurance company is only going to cover $1,500. We may talk about sometime in the future whether or not that's a wise move. In fact, I remember a couple of years ago, my wife never lets me live this down. If she listens to this episode, she's going to laugh and say, yep, you're right. I was backing out of our yard. We were renting a house while we were building our current farmhouse, and I backed up square into a tree. The sensors were going off on the Ford Excursion. It was beeping, telling me it was there, and I backed up, and the limb hit perfectly the back right quarter panel of the car and crunched it. I took it down to the body shop, and they're like, well, it's going to cost you $2,200. I decided to pay for that out of pocket versus filing a claim because I didn't want to have a claim on my coverage. And to me, being I already had a $1,000 deductible, it didn't make sense for me with the cost increases that I would have occurred because of that claim. So I just decided not to file it. So that's what collision covers. It covers pretty much everything other than animals. Many policies will actually write out animal damage. So I live in the country and we have deer hop across the road on a regular basis. Let's just say, for example, that I happen to hit Bambi. I'd hate it for Bambi, but I hit Bambi and Bambi caused some real damage to the car. Some policies, collision does not cover the impact caused by an animal. On the other hand, if you have collision, the second coverage on there is what's called comprehensive. Comprehensive coverage is like the second layer onto collision. Collision is basic. Comprehensive is more intent. So basically it's caused by damage caused by something other than another vehicle. Let's say you're not in a wreck where a car hits you, but maybe you had, like I mentioned in a couple episodes ago, maybe you have a really bad hailstorm. I talked about how that we had a major hailstorm come through East Tennessee. Man, for a while there, the cars riding around Knoxville looked like they'd been driven onto a driving range at a golf course. I mean, there were little ball-peen hammer dents everywhere. Well, Comprehensive is going to step in and cover that type of a damage. Comprehensive will cover the deer. If the deer hops out in front of me as I'm driving home, then comprehensive coverage is going to repair my vehicle because of things outside of another vehicle that's going to hit. Now, my policy has zero deductible on that particular thing. Well, Justin, why is that? Well, because we live where deer are. And I've had many times I've hit deer. I haven't done any damage to my vehicle yet, but there's a lot of deer. So I have a zero policy deductible. Now, when I compared the price of a $500 or $1,000 deductible on that particular comprehensive coverage, and it didn't increase my premium but $2 a year. So, a rock comes off a tire, hits my vehicle, or breaks my windshield, comprehensive comes into play for me. And so I have a zero deductible there. Another thing that you often have when you're protecting your actual vehicle is uninsured motorist property damage. We talked about the uninsured motorist on the health side. So that, again, that's where somebody who doesn't have a comprehensive policy, doesn't have insurance, hits you, or maybe a hit and run happens and you get injured. The medical side comes in, takes care of the body. The property damage for uninsured motorist comes in and takes care of your vehicle. So if you are perhaps a victim of a hit and run, then if you have uninsured motorist as part of your auto insurance policy, then it'll come in and help repair your vehicle. So I'm going to challenge you to take a look at the Financially Simple blog. I'm looking at my coverage details, and I'm going to share with you that gives you the limits that I use. Now, I'm not recommending you use these same limits. Every state is different. Every company has different bands on their limits, which may or may not have additional cost. Your vehicles may have different benefits or features which cause a lower or a higher discount. So, for example, I have two discounts. One, because both of my vehicles have anti-lock brakes on them, and that's the way that my company provides. I also have a discount for a passive restraint system that both of my vehicles have in there. Now, there's a couple of other things that we can add to auto policies. I have used some of these in the past, and some of these I've not used in the past. Perhaps the most common is what's called towing or labor. We call it roadside assistance coverage. In fact, as I record this today, no joke, about an hour ago, my wife calls me and she said, Justin, the Ford Excursion will not go into park. And now I knew I had a lot of work to do, so I said, well, I can't solve the problem right now, girlie, so let's call the wrecker, let's get it to the shop. Lo and behold, she gets there and the wrecker couldn't figure out how to get it out of a parking place, and I just happened to do a quick YouTube video search, found the problem, went over, and yours truly fixed the car without having to have any towing or labor. But at one point, I did have towing and labor. And in my particular policy, it was roughly $3.16 a month. In fact, I highlighted it when I went back and found my old towing and labor costs on my policies that I used to have. It cost me, anytime I had an issue, they would come in for roughly $100 value, and they bring gas, or they would do a tow, or they would fix a flat tire. Something I feel like I need to do as a husband, as a dad, is make sure that somebody can be there to work on vehicles when life happens. Now, you may say, Justin, why don't you have it anymore? Well, remember the last few episodes I talked about when we bought our new vehicle, I ended up using AAA for our lending. Well, whenever I went through AAA for our lending in order to get that excellent interest rate, I actually also was able to subscribe to their emergency package, which was roughly about the same price, by the way, that my insurance company was charging, for roughly the same features side by side. So you may want to have towing and labor as part of your auto insurance coverage. Another coverage that you can add is rental reimbursement. So let's say that you did have an accident and now your car is going to be in the shop for several days or weeks. I've even seen sometimes cars are in the body shop for a month. Well, if you have a rental reimbursement, then the policy is going to pay for you to have a car while your car is in the shop. So it's a nice little perk that you may or may not need depending on your lifestyle. I personally do not have that as part of my life, as part of my insurance package. I found it in my case that if I do need a vehicle, I can rent. I call them little gas savers, little go-go cars, whatever they may be, that gets 100 miles to the gallon, whatever the number is. I can rent one of those pretty inexpensively if that happens. Now, speaking of rental cars, one of the biggest questions that I've had many times in my life whenever I travel, remember, I'm a business owner, I travel. In fact, I was looking at my travel schedule over the next 6 months, and I think I'm going to be out of town roughly about 7 weeks in the next 6 months, various times. And there may be a day trip, there may be a 2-day trip, sometimes it may be a longer trip or a shorter trip. But whenever I travel, I often need a rental car. Depending on the city we're going to, I may have to drive. I know a particular city I'm going to be going to this year that I will need a rental car for a couple of days. Have you ever gone to pay for the rental car and they ask you, do you need coverage with that? And you're just like, I don't know. Well, if you carry a comprehensive and liability coverage on your personal car, in the United States, coverage typically will extend over to your rental car. That's a pretty standard practice. If you're renting a car in the United States that's really similar in value, then more than likely your insurance is going to be adequate. So, if I'm insuring my Ford F-150 and I go and rent a minivan or another truck or a little car that's of equal or lesser value, then in my particular case, I've confirmed with my agent that my policy covers any damages done to that rental car. However, there was an issue that I remember a while back with one of our clients. They went down to a beach town and they wanted to rent one of these luxury vehicles. Now, I would probably rent a Ford F-150 Raptor. It's a really, really nice truck. That's probably what I would rent. But this individual rented a Maserati. And they left their 2003 Honda Civic. Okay, so think about this. The 2003 Honda Civic at the time was probably worth $4,000 or $5,000. The Maserati, hundreds plus, depending on the brand or the model, if I can get it right, of that car. So if you're going out for a nice, fun weekend where you're going to rent a sports car, you may be required to take the extra coverage from the rental company. Another thing, when you're renting a car, you may want to talk about the collision damage waiver, or what they call a loss damage waiver. It's really not an insurance product. Rather, it's basically going to transfer the financial responsibility from the rental company, from you to the rental company whenever there's a damage or theft. So oftentimes they'll say, hey, do you want the waiver? It's not really coverage, but it's there to transfer the risk from you to the insurance company. I've never used that. Typically, whenever I travel, I don't want you to leave things in the car. Typically, my coverage on my particular insurance will more than satisfy the limits of the vehicles that I'm renting. Now, you may also deal with, when you rent a car, what's called a personal effects issue. We were in San Francisco with some friends, and our friend's vehicle was raided, and their laptop, their luggage, everything was stolen at this particular point. And whenever that happened, and believe it or not, their homeowner's policy came in and covered that risk. So that's another issue that you may want to consider, is checking with your homeowner's policy. So let's condense all this down to 3 little simple steps that you can basically boil down your auto insurance. The first is, if you drive an old car, like I used to have a 92 Camaro that I've talked about in the past episodes. I just sold that recently. Whenever my aunt, who I bought it from, passed away unexpectedly, it was time for it to go. Enough heartache in our family, and we wanted to open a new chapter up. So we sold the car. It was only worth maybe $7,000, but we only drove it maybe a couple of times a year. It didn't make sense to carry a comprehensive coverage. So if you're driving around in like that first car that you ever had, like my old pick-em-up truck they used to have that you could walk out and take a water hose and clean it out literally from the inside, you may not want to have comprehensive coverage. You may just need to have the basic plain Jane collision coverage. The other thing is that if you increase your liability limits, your deductibles may need to be adjusted. Because when you increase your liability limits, you're going to also increase your premium dollars. However, if you increase your deductibles, you're also going to reduce your costs. So your liability limits, maybe you're riding around, as I saw one of our clients, they had a $50,000 coverage on their limits. I said, guys, you really need to get this to a $500,000 medical coverage, a $250,000 comprehensive coverage. When they did that, their premiums went up. That's to be expected. But what we did is we moved their deductible from $0 to $1,000. And that basically kept roughly about a 40% discount. It basically kept the price about the same. So if you end up having to increase your limits, you can also increase your deductibles. The third thing I want to tell you is you don't drop your liability coverage under any circumstance. Remember, it's a rule. It's a law in many states. I think it's nationally actually now. It's a law in many states that, as we talked about earlier, your liability limits there, which is protecting you, your liability limits there are required. So you do not want to drop your liability limits under any circumstance. I don't care if the car is being held together by duct tape. Always hold your liability limits in place because it's there to protect your net worth. So now, for those of you who are still awake as we're talking about car insurance, I'm going to wrap it up. We're going to move through insurance. I'm going to try to just hit the high points from this point forward and talk about why we're controlling risk management. Guys, I say it every week. Life is hard. It is. But life is good. Life is actually outstanding. Life can be frustrating. Insurance is boring. I get it. Money doesn't have to be frustrating or boring. Let's continue to make our lives at least financially simple. Hey, y'all go out and make it a great day.